So every single year in the NFL draft, the last person selected has a rather uh, unflattering nickname. They're called Mr. Irrelevant. The most famous of those is probably Brock Purdy, who is the first Mr. Irrelevant to lead a team, to win any games, frankly. Brock Purdy is the most famous Mr. Irrelevant by far. But today, we are going to look at the very first Mr. Irrelevant recorded in human history. Welcome to Walking Through the Word. We're in Ruth chapter 4 today. And when we left off at the end of chapter 3, Naomi had told Ruth, don't worry, Boaz is going to make sure that this gets taken care of as quickly as possible. In other words, Boaz is living up to his name, Swift Strength. So at the beginning of chapter 4, verse 1, we see this happening. We see Boaz, meanwhile, so while Ruth and Naomi are talking, it's like watching an old Super Friends, meanwhile at the Fortress of Justice. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. So what's the significance of the town gate? Well, that's where all business transactions were held back then. All the old guys would sit around, kind of like you think about old guys sitting around the local coffee shop, drinking coffee and talking about things. It's kind of what they did here. All of the town leaders would come and they would sit and they would conduct business. And Boaz was one of these men. Boaz was an elder of the town. So Boaz comes there and he sits and he waits for the guardian redeemer. Remember, this is the one that could take over Naomi's property and also marry Ruth, as we're about to see here. And Boaz says in chapter 4, verse 1, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So the actual translation of "my friend" is not accurate here. It actually means so-and-so, meaning that the writer of Ruth considered this person so irrelevant that they didn't even bother to give them even a made-up name. Their name is so-and-so. Come over here, so-and-so, and sit down. The original Mr. Irrelevant has arrived on the scene. So Mr. Irrelevant goes over and sits down. And Boaz takes in verse 2, 10 of the elders of the town and says, "Sit with us." And so they did. And then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know, for no one has the right to do it except you, but I'm next in line." Now, this little scene here does bring up a little bit of question. Naomi had this piece of property. Why didn't she use it right now? Why didn't she try to sell it? Well, it's entirely possible that when Elimelech and his sons and his whole family left, that they actually sold the land or they lost the land to someone. But in Jewish tradition, the guardian redeemer, the kinsman redeemer, has the opportunity to buy back, to redeem not only the person, but also land that was sold away for hardship, for whatever financial reason. So we can speculate that maybe that's what's happened here, is that there's an opportunity to buy back Naomi's land, and so that's what Boaz is bringing. And of course, the guardian redeemer hears this and he thinks, "Ooh, I want the land." And he says at the end of verse 4, "I will redeem it." And Boaz is shrewd. Boaz is smart because he understands the politics of the day. Because then he goes, "Oh, by the way," in verse 5. I love this literary moment here. "By the way, on the day that you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." Now, if you remember at the beginning of our conversation in Ruth, we talked about Onan, which is an Old Testament story about a man who didn't want to carry out his idea of a kinsman redeemer. He didn't want to carry on the bloodline of his brother, and so he intentionally spilled his seed outside of the woman's uterus to make sure that she didn't get pregnant, and God's judgment was pronounced on him, and Onan was struck down dead. The Redeemer is looking at this, and he thinks, wait a minute, I don't want this lineage. I don't want the responsibility of it. As a matter of fact, he says, in verse 6, he says, I can't redeem it because that might endanger my own estate. In other words, if I have a child through Ruth, then he could potentially lay claim to my stuff, and then my children have issues and so on and so forth. Boaz is shrewd. He's smart. Naomi also knows this. Naomi is far smarter, I think, than she lets on here because she also understands the politics of the day. And she knows that Boaz, who apparently doesn't have any children of his own at this time, would gladly take Ruth as a lineage. She also probably was aware of who the kinsman redeemer in front of him was, that he probably had some kind of family, and that this would be the end result, or at least she hoped. So then, in verse 7, we see that they decide to finalize the transaction, and so they trade shoes. I don't know why. Not even the writer of Ruth knows why. They say here, apparently this was the method of legalizing transactions back in the day. He, kind of like us, says, I don't know why they do it, but this is why they do it. And so, the guardian redeemer says to Boaz, buy it yourself, and they have the transaction. The sandal is removed, and the deal is done. So tomorrow, we're going to finish the story, and we're going to see how beautiful the story of God is within this narrative of Ruth. We'll see you next time.